Florence Garrison had ridden 400 miles on a borrowed horse, with a loaded revolver on her hip and a letter in her pocket that promised her everything she had ever been owed, and she was not about to let a sun-weathered cowboy with steady eyes and a quiet voice tell her that none of it was hers. The summer of 1878 had turned the Arizona Territory into a furnace. The red earth cracked beneath the hooves of her roan mare as Florence guided the animal down the main street of Callow Creek, a town that looked like it had been dropped from a great height and simply stayed where it landed. Saloons faced general stores. A blacksmith's shop belched smoke into an already scorching sky. Children chased a mongrel dog between wagon wheels, and old men sat outside the barber shop watching everything with the patient disinterest of men who had already seen too much of the world to be surprised by any of it. Florence was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pulled back into a practical braid beneath a battered, wide-brimmed hat. Her dress had once been a deep green, but the long days of riding had faded it, and the hem was caked with the particular red dust of the territory. She sat straight in the saddle nonetheless, because her mother had always said that posture was the one thing poverty could not take from a person, and Florence had made it her business to keep at least that. She had come for what was hers. Her father, Edmund Garrison, had died 3 months ago in this very town. She had received the telegram at the boarding house in Tucson, where she had been working as a seamstress, and then she had sat very still for a long time with the paper in her hands. Edmund Garrison had left her when she was 9 years old. He had walked out of their small house in New Mexico with his hat on his head and a carpetbag in his hand, and a promise on his lips that he would send for her and her mother once he had made his fortune. That promise had aged into a scar that Florence carried quietly, the way a person carries an old break in a bone that never healed quite right. But along with the telegram announcing his death had come a second letter, written in a lawyer's hand, informing her that Edmund Garrison had, in fact, made something of himself in Callow Creek. He had owned a cattle ranch called the Garrison Quarter, approximately 2,000 acres of good grazing land, a house, several outbuildings, a herd, and various other assets. The letter stated that Florence, as his sole surviving heir, was entitled to the full inheritance. It also stated that the ranch was currently being managed by one Matthew Bailey, a man her father had hired 4 years ago, and that Mr. Bailey would be in possession of the relevant documents and accounts pertaining to the estate. Florence had folded that letter very carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, and she had not let herself feel anything about it until she was well outside Tucson and alone on the road with only the mare and the open country around her. Then she had let herself feel angry. 4 years of a man managing her inheritance, and no one had written to tell her the ranch existed until her father was already in the ground. She pulled her horse up in front of the building that bore a painted sign reading Callow Creek Land and Deed Office, and she tied the reins to the hitching post with more force than was strictly necessary. Inside, a young clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up at her from behind a high counter. She introduced herself, stated her business, and watched his eyes go slightly wide with recognition. "Miss Garrison," he said, and then cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Bailey was here just yesterday, actually, filing the quarterly accounts. He'll be out at the quarter, I expect. It's about 7 miles northeast of town, past the Red Bluff. You can't miss it." She thanked him in a tone that did not particularly thank him and walked back out into the heat. 7 miles northeast. She watered her horse at the trough by the farrier's and bought herself a biscuit from a woman selling them from a basket outside the general store, because she had not eaten since the previous evening, and she intended to be sharp when she arrived at the Garrison Quarter. She intended to be many things, in fact: clear, firm, entirely unmoved by whatever excuses this Matthew Bailey might offer for 4 years of silence. The road out of town dissolved into a track, and the track wound through country that was, despite everything, heartbreakingly beautiful. The red bluffs rose on either side like cathedral walls, and the desert floor was scattered with saguaro cactus and pale green brush and occasional bursts of late wildflowers in yellows and purples that seemed improbable in such heat. Hawks circled high and lazy overhead. The light had that particular quality that Florence had only ever found in the Southwest, a quality of weight and depth, as though the sun were pressing the landscape into something permanent. She rounded a bend, and the ranch came into view below her on a broad, flat stretch of land, and she pulled the mare up and simply looked at it for a moment. It was not a grand place, but it was a good one. The main house was a long, low adobe structure with a wide covered porch running its full length, and it looked solid and cool and permanent. Beside it stood a bunkhouse, a barn of considerable size, a smaller outbuilding she took to be a smokehouse, and a chicken coop. The corrals were well made, the fences straight. Beyond the buildings, cattle grazed in the brown grass, a herd she estimated at perhaps 200 head. Her father had built this. The man who had walked away from her with a carpet bag and a broken promise had spent 15 years building something real, and he had left it to her, and she did not know whether to be grateful or to be furious about the long silence that had surrounded all of it. She rode down. A man emerged from the barn as she came into the yard. He was tall and lean, perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark hair that had been slightly too long in the sun, and the kind of brown that spoke of years of outdoor work. He wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, working trousers, and well-worn boots. His hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had been working with his hands and had pushed it back out of the way at some point and not bothered to fix it since. He stood still and watched her ride into the yard with an expression she could not immediately read. Not guarded, exactly. Careful, perhaps, as though he were choosing where to put his feet before he committed to the ground. She dismounted without waiting for assistance, which was her habit, and led her horse a few steps before stopping to face him. "I am looking for Matthew Bailey," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was low and even, and he was already looking at her with a kind of recognition that she had not expected. "I am Florence Garrison," she said. "Edmund Garrison was my father." Something moved across his face then. It was quick and complicated, and she catalogued it without yet understanding it. Not surprise, she thought. He had known she might come. Something closer to relief, perhaps, and underneath that, something that looked very much like a long and careful reckoning coming finally to its moment. "Miss Garrison," he said, and removed his hat entirely. "I have been expecting you." She studied him. "Have you? Then you will understand why I am here." "I do," he said simply. "I have come for my inheritance." She pulled the lawyer's letter from her pocket and held it out. He did not take it. He looked at it for a moment and then back at her. "I know what it says," he said. "I helped the lawyer draft the notification." That stopped her. "You helped draft it?" "Yes. You knew I was his daughter." "I did. You knew about me for 4 years." He did not flinch from this. He met it directly, which she had not entirely expected, and there was something in his willingness to meet it that made her frustration briefly more complicated than simple anger. "I did," he said again, "and I think you deserve an explanation for that. I would offer you a seat in some water first, because you look like you have been riding hard and this sun is not merciful to anyone today." Florence looked at him for a moment with narrowed eyes. She was thirsty, and she was tired, and she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she would be a more effective adversary after a glass of water and a moment in the shade. She nodded once and followed him onto the porch. He brought her water in a clean tin cup, and then went to tend to her horse without being asked, which she noticed. She sat in one of the wooden chairs on the porch and drank the water and looked out across the land that was, according to all legal instruments, hers, and she tried to prepare herself for whatever he was going to say. He came back and sat in the chair across from her, his hat resting on his knee, and he looked at her with those careful eyes and he said, "Your father told me about you. Not right away, not even in the first year." But he talked about you more as he got older, and I came to understand that leaving you was the thing he regretted most in his life." Florence said nothing. "He wrote to you," Matthew Bailey said, "3 times in the first 2 years. The letters came back. He assumed you had moved." "We did move," Florence said, her voice steady. "My mother and I moved twice trying to find work." She paused. "He did not try again. He did not know where you had gone. He tried asking around through people he knew in New Mexico, but it came to nothing." He looked down at his hat for a moment. "I am not telling you this to excuse him. He made choices. He stayed here and built this place, and he let the distance grow, and that is on him. I am telling you because I want you to understand the whole of it." "What is the whole of it?" Florence asked. He looked up at her again. "The whole of it is that when he got sick 2 years ago, the first thing he did was write a proper will leaving everything to you. He paid a lawyer in Tucson and had it filed and registered. And when it became clear he was not going to recover, he asked me directly, man to man, to make sure you knew. He gave me what information he had, which was not much. I spent a considerable amount of time and money trying to locate you before the lawyer finally traced you through your employment records." Florence sat with that for a long moment. The anger was still there, but it had shifted in shape, become something more like grief underneath, and she did not entirely welcome that because grief was harder to carry than anger. Anger had edges. It held its shape in your hands. "Why did no one contact me sooner?" she asked. 4 years ago, 3 years ago. The will was filed 2 years ago. Why did the first letter I received come after he was already dead?" Matthew leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, and she noticed that his hands were rough from work, but that he held them carefully, as though he was used to using them with precision. "When I found out about you early on, I told your father he should contact you. More than once." His voice was steady but not without feeling. "He said he would. He kept saying he would. He was not a coward in most ways, your father, but about you he was afraid. He was afraid you would not want to hear from him, and I think he was more afraid that he deserved whatever you might say if you did." Florence looked away across the yard. A chicken picked its way between fence posts with great dignity. Somewhere in the distance, a cow issued a low complaint to the afternoon. "That is not an excuse either," Matthew said quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I told him what I thought, but it was not my place to write to you against his wishes. Not then. And after he died. The lawyer wrote within the week. I made certain of it." She turned back to him. "You have been managing this ranch for 4 years. "I have. The accounts, the herd, all of it." "Yes. And it never occurred to you to simply keep it." He looked at her as though the question surprised him, not because it was impertinent, but because the answer was so obvious to him that he could not entirely credit that she needed to ask it. "It is not mine," he said. Just those 3 words, and they sat between them in the afternoon heat, with a weight and simplicity that Florence found unexpectedly disarming. She stood up and smoothed her skirt and looked out at the land again. "I would like to see the accounts," she said. "Of course," he said. "They are inside." The inside of the house was cool and clean and more comfortable than she had anticipated. There was a stone fireplace at one end of the main room, and good plain furniture, and a long table with a lamp above it that served as a kind of working desk. On a shelf along one wall were several leather-bound ledgers, and he took these down with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly where everything was. He laid them open for her, and he walked her through them with the kind of patient thoroughness that told her these books had been kept with genuine care. Income from the sale of cattle. Expenses for feed, equipment, wages for the 2 ranch hands who worked the property, repairs to the barn after a storm the previous winter. Every line was clear and accounted for, and at the end of it Florence sat back and looked at the final sum and then looked at him. "This is more than I expected," she said. "Your father had good land and a good instinct for cattle, and we had 2 very favorable seasons." She looked at him carefully. "The accounts show your salary as a ranch manager." "Is that what you are, just the manager?" "That is what I am," he said. She studied the ledgers again. "You could have paid yourself more." "I could have," he agreed, "but you did not." "No." Florence closed the ledger with a definitive sound and looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made his face warm and his eyes very clear, and she noticed, despite herself, that they were a dark gray-green, the color of river water over stone. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "I will be honest with you, because honesty seems to me to be the most efficient approach. I came here fully prepared to find a man who had taken advantage of an absent heir. I had a great deal of righteous anger prepared for exactly that situation." The corner of his mouth moved very slightly, not quite a smile but the shadow of one. "I can see that," he said. "You have made it considerably more complicated," she said, and she meant it as a statement of fact and not as a complaint, though she was aware it sounded like both. "I am sorry for the complication," he said, and he said it with enough genuine feeling that she believed him. She stood up and walked to the window that looked out across the yard toward the pasture. The light was going golden now, the late afternoon sun beginning its long descent behind the bluffs, and the land had that particular evening quality of becoming more beautiful as it cooled. "I do not know how to run a cattle ranch," she said, her back to him. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Most people do not when they first start." She turned around. "I am not going to sell it," she said, "in case you were wondering." He nodded slowly as though this did not surprise him and perhaps even pleased him, though he kept his expression careful. "I would need to learn," she said. "A great deal, I imagine." "A fair amount," he agreed. She looked at him steadily. "I am asking if you would be willing to stay on as manager and to teach me what you know." He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was, and she held his gaze and did not look away because she had not ridden 400 miles on a borrowed horse to look away from anything. "Yes," he said. "I would be willing to do that." Outside, the first crickets were beginning their evening song, and somewhere in the pasture a horse called, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a working place at the end of a day's work. A quiet that felt, to Florence's surprise, less like a foreign country than she had expected. She asked if there was a room she could use in the house, and he said yes and showed her, and it was a clean, spare room with a good bed and a window facing east. She set her bag on the floor and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the darkening desert, and she thought about her father building this place and never sending for her. And she thought about the man in the other room who had kept everything intact and exact and accounted for, who had never said a word to her in 4 years. And she thought that the world was complicated, and that she had always known it was, but that knowing it and feeling it were two different things entirely. She was woken the next morning before dawn by the sound of the ranch coming alive, the horses in the corral, the low voices of the 2 ranch hands, a man named Caleb who was perhaps 50 and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been doing physical labor for 3 decades, and a younger man named Hector, perhaps 20 or so, who had a quick smile and a habit of talking to the horses as though they were in on some shared joke. Matthew was already in the yard when she came out, directing the morning work with quiet efficiency. He looked up when she appeared on the porch, and something moved through his expression briefly and was gone before she could name it. "Early riser," he said. "Always," she said. "What can I do?" He looked at her for a moment with that careful assessment she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of thinking before he spoke. "Can you ride well?" he asked. "Well enough." "Then ride with me this morning. I do a circuit of the property every day. You should know what you own." She saddled her own horse, and he saddled his, a long-legged bay with a sensible head, and they rode out together in the early light while the sky was still the deep blue of just before dawn turning pink in the east. He showed her the property's boundaries, marked with fence posts and natural landmarks, the red bluff to the north, a dry creek bed that served as the southern edge, a stand of cottonwoods that marked the east. He knew every inch of it, not in the way of a man who has memorized a map, but in the way of someone who has walked it and ridden it and cared for it over time, who has seen it in every season and weather and knows what it is in the way that you know the face of someone you have loved. He told her about the cattle, the breeds, the grazing patterns, the water sources that mattered in summer when the creek was dry. He told her about the market in Tucson, the cattle drives to the railhead, the prices that were good and the prices that were ruinous, and how to tell which was which. He told her about the land itself, the soil and what it could and could not support, where the grass was deepest, where it was thin. Florence listened to all of it and asked questions, and he answered them without condescension, as though it were perfectly natural that she should want to understand what she had inherited and perfectly reasonable that she should be capable of doing so. The sun was well up and the heat already building by the time they turned back toward the house, and they rode for a while in silence that was, Florence noticed, not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been talking well and do not feel the need to fill every gap. "My father," she said after a while. "What was he like?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not rush to answer. "He was a hard worker," he said at last. "He had a temper, but he did not hold grudges. He was fair to the men who worked for him. He was not easy to know, but once he trusted you entirely." "Did you like him?" Another considered pause. "Respected him," he said, "which is not quite the same thing. I came to understand him over time, and I think he was a man who carried a great deal of regret that he did not know how to set down." Florence looked out across the land. "He should have come for me," she said, "or sent for me. He should have tried harder." "Yes," Matthew said, and his voice was simple and clear and did not try to soften it. "He should have." She glanced at him sideways. "You did not try to argue with that." "I would not," he said, "because it is true." She looked forward again. The ranch buildings were visible ahead, warm-colored adobe in the morning light, and she thought that she could see, for the first time, something of what her father had been building here. Not a fortune, exactly, but a life. A serious, deliberate, well-tended life, and the tragedy of it was not that he had built it, but that he had been unable to build the bridge that might have brought her to it while there was still time. The first week passed in a kind of purposeful immersion. Florence threw herself at the learning of it with the same focused energy she had always brought to whatever she needed to do to survive. She learned to assess cattle, to read the signs of illness and health in a herd. She learned the particular language of ranch accounts, the difference between operating costs and capital expenditures, the timing of cattle sales, and how the market moved with the season. She learned the names and habits and personalities of the horses, the lay of the water sources, the particular dry season routines that kept the operation sound through the brutal Arizona summer. Matthew taught her all of it without ceremony, simply showing her what needed to be shown, answering what needed to be answered, letting her do the things she could do, and being present beside her for the things that were new. He had a patience that did not condescend, a thoroughness that was not tedious, and a quiet that she began to find less guarded than she had first thought and more simply the product of a man who chose his words with care because he meant them when he used them. He was also, she noticed in the particular way that you notice things you are not trying to notice, entirely without pretension. He ate the same food as the hands, worked the same hours, and never spoke about himself in a way that would have suggested he thought he deserved more than what he had. His bunkhouse room was spare and neat. He read at night by lamplight, serious books. She could see the spines from the main room, history and natural science, and once, with a slight private smile that she had not been meant to see, a battered novel. She found him one evening sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, looking out at the sky where a tremendous sunset was happening in shades of orange and deep rose over the western bluffs, and she brought her own coffee and sat beside him, not asking permission and not requiring it, because this was her porch and she had decided she liked sitting on it in the evenings. "You have been here 4 years, she said. 4 years and 3 months, he said. "Where were you before that?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was in New Mexico for 2 years, Texas before that. I grew up in Missouri." "You have moved a great deal." "I have. I was looking for something worth staying for." She looked at him. "And you found it here." He met her gaze, and something in his look was warm and direct in a way that made the air feel briefly different. "I found work worth doing," he said carefully, "and land worth caring for." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the sunset. "That is a particular kind of answer," she said. "I suppose it is," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice without looking at him. They sat in the cooling evening, and the sky went from rose to deep purple to the first scattered stars, and neither of them moved to go inside, and Florence thought that this was one of those moments that would settle somewhere in her memory and stay there. 2 weeks into her time at the Garrison quarter, a man came to the ranch that Florence did not like from the first moment she saw him ride into the yard. His name was Gerald Prout, and he was a land buyer of the sort that had been appearing in the Arizona territory with increasing regularity in those years. Men with good suits and Eastern money who had identified that land prices were rising, and that ranches in difficulty could be purchased cheaply and sold at a considerable profit once the territory settled and the railroad pushed further west. He was perhaps 45, with a broad face and small, assessing eyes, and he addressed himself to Matthew as though Florence were not standing 3 feet away. "Bailey," he said, shaking Matthew's hand, "I heard the Garrison girl came out from Tucson." "Miss Garrison is here," Matthew said, and turned to include her directly. "Miss Garrison, this is Gerald Prout. He had been in correspondence with your father about a potential purchase of the southern section before Mr. Garrison passed." Florence looked at Prout with steady eyes. "Mr. Prout," she said, "I am afraid any discussions about the sale of any part of this property died with my father." Prout smiled the smile of a man who expects women to be talked around. "Now, Miss Garrison, I understand you are new to ranching. The southern section is marginal land, rocky, not ideal for grazing. Your father himself was considering selling it off, and I think if you had a chance to sit down and look at the numbers—" "I have looked at the number," she said. "I have been looking at the numbers for 2 weeks. The southern section has the best access to the seasonal water source that keeps the north pasture herd healthy through July and August. It is not marginal land, Mr. Prout. It is foundational land, and it is not for sale." Prout's smile cooled slightly. He looked to Matthew with the particular look of a man expecting male corroboration. Matthew looked back at him with a pleasant, entirely unhelpful expression. "Miss Garrison knows this ranch," Matthew said simply. Prout made several more attempts to press his case over the next half hour, and Florence declined each of them with increasing precision and decreasing patience, and eventually Prout rode back out of the yard with his dignity somewhat rearranged and his offer intact and unaccepted. When he was gone, Florence let out a long breath and leaned against the fence post. Matthew came to stand beside her, and when she looked up at him his expression was open and, she thought, genuinely pleased. "That was well done," he said. "He was never going to take a woman seriously," she said. "Men like that never do." "Some men are slower than others," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that felt like a different kind of statement than the words alone carried. She looked at him. "Are you one of them?" "No," he said, and held her gaze without wavering. "I am not." She believed him, which was interesting because she had not particularly intended to. She found, as the weeks passed, that she was spending more time in his company than was strictly necessary for the running of the ranch, and that this was not entirely accidental. She found reasons to ride with him in the mornings and to sit on the porch in the evenings, and she found that the conversations they had were the kind that moved through subjects with genuine curiosity on both sides, ranging from the practical to the philosophical in the easy way of two people who are well matched in their thinking and have found that out. He told her about Missouri, about his family, his father who had farmed and his mother who had read to him every evening until he was old enough to read for himself, the younger sisters he had not seen in 3 years and wrote to regularly. She told him about New Mexico, about her mother, a woman of considerable backbone who had raised Florence alone without complaint and without sentimentality, who had died 2 years earlier of a fever that had left Florence entirely without family in the world. She told him about the seamstress work in Tucson, the long days and small wages, and the particular exhaustion of survival without margin. He listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who was genuinely interested, and she noticed that he never once suggested she should have done things differently or that her life should have been different, which was a quality she had not always encountered in men, and which she found, as it accumulated, to be something she actively valued. One evening after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dinner things were cleared, they were sitting at the big table with the lamp between them, and she was working through the accounts for the month while he mended a piece of harness with the neat practiced stitching of a man accustomed to doing for himself, and she came across a discrepancy she did not understand. "There is a line here," she said, "from 8 months ago. A payment out, no description, almost exactly the amount of your monthly salary. Was this an extra payment to yourself?" He looked up from the harness and looked at the ledger she was pointing to, and then he sat back and was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "That was a different kind of payment." She waited. "There was a drought the previous summer," he said. "It was worse in the eastern pasture. We lost some weight on the herd. The quarterly sale was lower than projected, and there were repairs needed on the barn roof after a storm. The operating funds were tight for 1 month." He looked at her directly. "I covered the shortfall myself, out of my own savings." Florence stared at him. "You paid the ranch's operating costs out of your own pocket?" "Temporarily," he said. "I was reimbursed the following month when the accounts recovered. It is there if you look at the entry 3 months later." She looked. He was right. The repayment was there, exact to the dollar. "Why did you not simply draw down the reserve fund?" she asked. "There was a reserve fund." "There was," he said, "but I did not want to draw on it without the owner's authorization. The owner was not here to ask." Florence looked at him across the lamp's light and tried to find the angle on this that would make it less extraordinary and could not locate one. "Matthew," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formal address, and she saw him notice it, his expression shifting slightly, becoming warmer. "It was your money," he said simply. "It was always your money. I was keeping it safe." She looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. "You have kept it all safe," she said. "For years, everything, the land, the herd, the accounts, the buildings, you kept all of it." "Yes," he said, "without knowing if anyone would ever come to claim it." He held her gaze across the lamplight. "I knew you would come," he said, "or I believed you would. Your father was certain you would if you knew. He talked about you as though you were not a question but an inevitability." Something in her chest moved in a way that she was not prepared for. She looked down at the ledger again and pressed her palm flat against the page, and she took a breath. "He left before I was old enough to remember him clearly," she said. "I have one clear memory of him. He was teaching me to tell time on the clock in our kitchen. He was patient about it. I remember the patience of it." She looked up. "That is the only thing I have of him." Matthew was looking at her with an expression of such careful and genuine feeling that she had to look away from it for a moment, because it was the kind of expression that, if you let it, would take something loose in you that you had kept tied down for a long time. "I am sorry you did not have more time with him," he said quietly. "I think he was, too." She gathered herself, and she was good at gathering herself. It was a practiced art, and she thanked him for telling her and closed the ledger and said she was going to bed. And she went to her room and sat at the window for a long time looking at the stars, which in the Arizona territory were obscenely numerous and brilliant, and seemed, on nights like this, to be engaged in some private conversation about the smallness and importance of the things happening beneath them. In the morning she saddled her horse before he was even out of the bunkhouse, which was not her usual habit, and she rode the south fence line alone and let the desert morning work on her until she felt like herself again, which did not take as long as she had expected, because this land, she was beginning to understand, had a particular way of clarifying things. It was Hector who, one afternoon while they were checking on a small group of calves in the east pasture, said with the cheerful directness of someone who had not yet learned to be subtle, "You know, Matthew talks different since you got here." Florence looked at him with her eyebrows slightly raised. Does he? Yeah. I mean, he was always decent to us. Good boss, fair, not mean about things, but he was quiet. Like quiet past what working quiet is, you know. Now he talks more, laughs sometimes. Hector shrugged with the philosophical ease of youth. I think he was lonely before. Florence turned this observation over in her mind and said nothing, but she filed it away with careful attention. She talked to Caleb one morning while she was learning from him how to assess which calves were ready to separate from the herd, and she asked him, with what she hoped was casual interest, how long Matthew had been at the quarter before she arrived. Caleb squinted at the calf he was examining and said, from almost the start of it. Your dad brought him in about 6 months after he started the herd. I've been here almost as long. Bailey's good people, rare kind. He let the calf go and straightened up. The kind that does what he says and says what he does. You know that kind. I am coming to know it, Florence said. She found Matthew that same afternoon mending a section of fence on the north pasture, working with the quiet, methodical focus he brought to all physical work. And she rode up and dismounted and helped him hold the wire while he worked, and they worked in companionable silence for a while. Hector says you were lonely before I came, she said, without particular preamble. He paused very briefly in his work, and she heard a sound from him that might have been either a short laugh or a sound of private resignation. Hector is not wrong, he said, but he does not know the half of it. She looked at him as he worked. What is the half he does not know? He straightened up and looked at her across the fence wire, and the afternoon sun was behind her, and he was looking at her with the full attention of those dark gray-green eyes, and he said, before you came, I used to tell myself that I was keeping the ranch in good order because it was the right thing to do. And that was true. But I also knew that your father talked about you with a particular pride and love, and I had, over time, formed a very clear idea of who you were from what he told me. He said you were determined, that you would fight for what you believed was right, that you had your mother's intelligence and his stubbornness. He paused. He was not wrong about any of it. Florence held his gaze. You formed an idea of a person you had never met. I did. And what do you think of the actual person? He looked at her for a long, steady moment, and the afternoon breeze came through the high grass, and the hawks circled overhead, and everything was very still. I think, he said carefully, that the actual person exceeded every part of the idea. Florence felt the warmth of that move through her, and she did not look away from him. That is a very particular kind of answer, she said, which was what she had said to him once before on the porch, and she saw the acknowledgment of that in his eyes. I suppose it is, he said, and this time she could see the smile rather than just hear it, and it was a good smile, genuine and warm and slightly uncertain in a way that she found she liked very much. She took a step toward him and he did not step back. Matthew Bailey, she said, if you have something to say to me, you might as well say it plainly. He reached up and removed his hat and held it at his side, and he looked at her with that openness she had come to recognize as his most honest self, the one beneath the careful quietness. I have something to say, he said. I have had it for some weeks, but I was not sure it was my place to say it, given that I work for you and you have a great deal of things to be sorting out, and I did not want to add complications to an already complicated situation. You have already said, she reminded him, that I am quite good with complications. The smile came fully then, warm and real and slightly relieved, and she thought it might be one of the more genuinely handsome things she had seen. Florence Garrison, he said, I believe I am falling in love with you, and I am fairly certain it started before I ever met you, which I understand sounds like a considerable amount of foolishness. She stepped forward and took the hat from his hand and set it on the fence post between them, and then she looked up at him from very close and said, It does not sound like foolishness. No, he said, and his voice was low and careful. No, she said. It sounds like a man who was paying attention. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair that the wind had loosened back behind her ear, gently, as though she were something worth being careful with, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers for a moment, holding it there. They stood like that at the fence post on the north pasture of the Garrison quarter, with the hawks overhead and the cattle moving in the grass below them. And then he bent forward slowly, and she rose toward him, and they kissed, in the particular gravity of two people who have been moving toward each other with the deliberate patience of tides. And it was warm and sure and honest, which was the most she could have asked for and more than she had expected. They rode back to the ranch in the long gold of the late afternoon, close enough that their knees touched occasionally as the horses walked side by side. And when they came into the yard, Hector looked up from the water trough where he was watering horses and looked at them both, and said nothing whatsoever but smiled a smile of enormous personal satisfaction, and turned his back with the tact of someone who has decided to mind his business for once. In the days that followed, something changed in the atmosphere of the ranch. Not in its work, which continued with the same daily discipline, but in the air between Florence and Matthew, which had lost the particular careful quality of two people navigating toward each other, and had become something warmer and more settled, the comfort of two people who had decided to stop being cautious. He would bring her coffee in the mornings before the work began, and she would bring him his in the evenings, and these were small things, but they accumulated into a language of their own. They rode together each morning, and the conversations had moved beyond the practical into the personal and the philosophical, and she found that he had considered opinions on things and was willing to hear hers and change his mind when she made a good argument, which in her experience of men was not a universal quality. She told him about the injustices she had witnessed in her years in Tucson, the way that women who worked were paid less than men for the same labor, the way that workers of Mexican and indigenous descent were paid less still. And she said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has observed these things closely and thought about them hard. And he listened and agreed with her, and said that he had grown up watching his father underpay the two Mexican farmhands who worked beside them without complaint, and that it had troubled him as a child and troubled him more as an adult who now had some choice about how he operated. "Hector is paid the same as Caleb," he told her. "Always has been." "I know," she said. "I checked the accounts." He looked at her with the particular fond expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of delight. "Of course you did." One afternoon in late July, a man came to the ranch who was not Gerald Prout but was in some ways related to his project. He was a lawyer from Tucson named Harris, and he arrived with papers that he presented to Florence with the cheerful confidence of someone who expected his business to be uncomplicated. The papers were an argument, dressed in legal language, that a portion of the Garrison quarter's eastern boundary was in dispute. A neighboring rancher named Clifton Marsh had apparently been claiming for some time that Edmund Garrison's original survey had been carried out incorrectly, and that 40 acres along the eastern edge actually belonged to the Marsh Ranch. Florence read the papers very carefully while the lawyer sat across from her at the table, and Matthew stood by the window reading nothing at all but radiating a focused, quiet attention. "Mr. Harris," she said when she had finished, "can you tell me when this dispute was first raised?" "About 18 months ago, I believe." "And my father's response?" Harris looked slightly uncomfortable. "Your father was unwell at the time and did not respond formally." Florence set the papers down and folded her hands. "And in the absence of a formal response, your client has continued to use this as the basis of an ongoing claim. That is the situation, yes." "Mr. Bailey," Florence said, without taking her eyes off Harris, "the original survey, where is it?" "In the deed box," he said. "I can get it." He left and returned with a tin document box from which he produced the original survey map, dated 1868, registered and stamped by the Territorial Surveyor's Office. Florence spread it on the table beside the Marsh claim. The eastern boundary was exactly as it appeared on the Garrison quarter's registration. There was no ambiguity. The 40 acres in question were clearly and legally part of the Garrison quarter. She explained this to Harris with reference to the specific survey points, the specific registry numbers, and the specific legal section of territorial land law that governed boundary disputes, which she had read about in a volume she had found on her father's shelf, and which had been, she suspected, placed there by Matthew Bailey at some point in the previous 4 years. Harris left with his papers and his composure somewhat reduced, and Florence put the survey back in the box and the box back on the shelf, and then sat down with the calm of someone who has done something that needed doing. Matthew looked at her from across the room and said, "You read the land law volume." "I read everything on that shelf," she said. "I read it the first week I was here." He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was one she would have stored carefully if she had been storing things, and perhaps she was. "I put that book there for your father," he said. "2 years ago I thought he should know what was in it. Did he read it? I do not believe so." "Then it was waiting for me," she said. "I suppose it was," he said, and they looked at each other across the room with the particular warmth of two people who have found that the world has been arranging things in their direction for longer than they knew. The summer deepened, and the work of the ranch deepened with it. Florence learned more every day, and what she had thought of as learning a business increasingly felt like coming into something that was hers in a way that went beyond legal title. She walked the land in the early mornings and knew its sounds and smells. She knew the names of the cattle, the way you know the names of neighbors. She knew when the evening clouds over the bluffs meant rain and when they meant nothing, and she knew how to read the sky for the dry lightning that could start a fire in the brush. Matthew was beside her for all of it, and she noticed that the quality of his presence had changed again, had become something more fully itself, less careful and more open, as though her arrival had given him permission to be more completely who he was. He laughed more, as Hector had said. He talked more. And he looked at her with a directness that was not presumptuous, but was not hidden either, the straightforward look of a man who has nothing to conceal about how he feels. One evening after a long day that had included repairing a section of the south fence that a steer had broken through, chasing the steer across a very hot piece of ground for longer than anyone wanted, and then sitting on the porch in a state of joint exhaustion while the stars came out, Matthew said, without any particular lead-up, "I want to ask you something." Florence, who was sitting with her boots off and her feet resting on the porch railing in a posture her mother would have found undignified, and she found entirely comfortable, looked at him. "Ask it," she said. He was sitting forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and his hat hanging between his hands, and he looked at her with the care and directness that was so particularly his. "I want to know if you would consider allowing me to be more than what I am," he said. "More than the manager, more than." He stopped and found the right words. "I want to know if there is a future here that I am part of, not because of the ranch. The ranch is yours and it should be yours, and I would work it for you as faithfully as I always have, whatever you decide. But I want to know if there is a future here with you, beside you, as your—" He stopped again. "Matthew Bailey," Florence said, and her voice had the warmth in it that she no longer bothered to contain. "Are you asking me to marry you?" He looked at her steadily. "I am doing it badly," he said. "You are doing it honestly," she said, "which I prefer." She swung her feet down from the railing and sat up properly, and looked at him in the lamplight that spilled from the window. And she thought about 400 miles on a borrowed horse, and a letter that had promised her everything she was owed, and a man she had come prepared to confront who had turned out to be something else entirely, something she had not accounted for in any of her preparations. "I came here with a great deal of anger," she said, "and I have set most of it down, not all. I'm still angry at my father for the years he wasted. I think I will always be a little angry at him for that, and I have decided that is acceptable." Matthew waited, watching her face. "But what I found here when I came," she said, "was not what I expected to find. I found the ranch, yes. I found the accounts, the land, the cattle. But I also found that someone had been caring for all of it, not just keeping it intact, but keeping it well, keeping it the way you keep something that matters to you. And that person turned out to be a man worth knowing." She looked at him. Worth more than knowing. He was very still, watching her. "Yes," she said. "I am saying yes." He crossed the distance between their chairs in one movement, and she stood to meet him, and he took her face between his hands with the same carefulness with which he did everything, as though she were worth being careful with, and he kissed her there on the porch of the Garrison quarter in the warm summer night with the stars of the Arizona Territory watching with their old, bright, silent attention. They were married in Callow Creek on a Saturday in October of 1878. In the small white church on the main street that had been built 3 years prior and still smelled of fresh wood. Caleb stood as witness for Matthew and a woman named Rosa, who ran the general store and had been kindly disposed toward Florence from the first day she arrived in town, stood for her. Hector wore a clean shirt and looked as though he might burst with entirely justified pride. The ceremony was simple and direct, which was appropriate for two people who were simple and direct. And when the minister asked the words and Matthew said them, he said them looking at her with the full attention of his eyes, and she said hers the same way. And the minister, who had done a great many weddings, thought privately that these two were the kind who meant it. Afterward there was a gathering at the ranch, a simple supper that Rosa helped to prepare, and several of the Callow Creek townspeople came, including the clerk from the deed office who turned red every time Florence looked at him, and whom she found she liked considerably better than she had on first meeting. Hector played the guitar with surprising skill, and the evening was warm and full of the easy pleasure of people who have been working hard and are glad to rest together. Later, after everyone had gone, Florence and Matthew sat on the porch in the particular quiet of a place after company has left, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the darkness of the land that was hers and was now theirs, and he put his arm around her and rested his chin against the top of her head, and they were quiet together in the deep and comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill everything with words. "I keep thinking about him," she said, after a while. "My father, I keep thinking that he would have liked this." "He would have," Matthew said. "He would have liked you. He would have been enormously proud of you and extremely intimidated by you, and he would have told me when you weren't listening that you were exactly what he always knew you would be." She felt his voice as a vibration in his chest under her cheek, and it was a good feeling, steady and warm. "And what did he always know I would be?" she asked. "Remarkable," Matthew said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you too," she said. "He already did," Matthew said. "He told me near the end that if you ever came, he hoped you would give me a chance. He said I was the most honest man he had ever hired, which was a considerable endorsement from a man who was not easy to satisfy." She smiled in the dark. "He had good judgment after all." "About that, yes," Matthew said. The fall was a beautiful one in the Arizona Territory, and the ranch work settled into its autumn rhythms, the thinning of the herd, the mending of equipment before winter, the stocking of the smokehouse, and the checking of the house against the cold months. Florence had learned enough by now that she and Matthew worked side by side without the asymmetry of teacher and student, more as two people with different but complementary knowledge meeting in the work, and the efficiency of it was satisfying to both of them. They made changes to the ranch house together, opening up the main room a little more, adding shelves for the books that were beginning to accumulate, as Florence discovered that her father had left not only the land volume but an eclectic selection of texts, and she and Matthew added to these from the selection at the general store and from occasional orders placed through the Tucson catalog. The house became, through these small accumulations, more fully lived in, the particular warmth of a place where two people are building something together. In the late fall, she and Matthew rode into Callow Creek together on an errand day, and she went to the deed office to file the formal resolution of the eastern boundary dispute, which the lawyer Harris had withdrawn from after receiving a very precise letter from Florence that had apparently made an impression, and she signed the papers that finalized the full and uncontested ownership of the Garrison quarter in her name, which was now her married name as well. She stood outside the deed office afterward in the October sun and felt the weight and solidity of that, the actuality of it. This land, this life. She had come for her inheritance and she had received it, and it was more complicated and more complete than any version of it she had imagined on that long ride from Tucson. Matthew came out of the general store across the street with a paper parcel of supplies and crossed to her, and she watched him come and thought, as she sometimes did, about the odd geometries of how things happened in the world, the specific combination of loss and anger and a borrowed horse that had brought her here to this. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. "It is fully ours." He looked at her with that warm, precise attention. "It has always been fully yours." "Ours," she said again, with mild emphasis, and he accepted this with the graceful certainty of a man who had been given something he had not expected to have and was determined not to take it lightly. They rode home in the afternoon sun, and the land was orange and gold and red around them, and the sky above was that particular deep October blue that made the world look freshly made, and they rode close together on the familiar track with the easy comfort of two people who are very well matched in their pace. The winter of 1878 into 1879 passed with the slow, deep quiet of a ranch well prepared for cold. The nights were long and the days clear and cold, and the work shifted from the outward work of summer to the inward work of winter, the mending of tack and gear, the careful management of winter stores, the keeping of the cattle through the cold months. They read together in the evenings by the fire, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes in the same companionable silence they had developed on the porch in summer. He was reading a history of the Western Territories that Florence found dry but he found absorbing, and she was reading a natural history of the Sonoran Desert that she had found at the back of a shelf, and that had become, to her considerable pleasure, one of the most interesting books she had ever read. They made each other tea from a tin of it that Rosa had given them, and outside the wind moved over the red bluffs, and the cattle were sheltered, and the horses in the barn were warm, and the Garrison quarter endured the winter with the solid assurance of a place well built and well tended. In the long evenings, Florence found herself talking to Matthew about things she had not talked about to anyone in a long time, about her mother, about the years of making do, about the particular freedom and the particular loneliness of a person without family in the world. He listened with the quality she had always valued in him, fully present, and without the need to fix what could not be fixed, content simply to hear it and to honor it. He told her about his own loneliness, which he had carried quietly and without complaint through 4 years on the ranch, the particular kind of loneliness that is not about isolation, but about the absence of the specific presence you are waiting for without knowing you are waiting. "You did not know you were waiting for me," she said one evening. "No," he said. "I did not know it was you specifically. I knew I was waiting for something, someone." He looked at her across the fire. "Your father used to say that you would come like a wind in the wrong direction, unexpected, that you would change the shape of things." Florence thought about that. "He said that." "More than once in the last year. He talked about you more then." Matthew's voice was quiet and careful. "I think he was trying to prepare the place for you, in whatever way he could." She looked into the fire for a long time. The anger that she had been carrying, the old, familiar weight of it, had continued to set itself down a little at a time, and in its place had come something more spacious, still complicated but less sharp. She did not entirely forgive her father. She was not sure she could or should, entirely. But she thought she could understand him, and she thought that understanding was a form of mercy that she could extend without requiring anything in return. "He prepared it well," she said. "He hired you." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "He hired me to run the ranch," he said. "What happened after that was not his plan." "No," she said, "but I think he would have approved." She saw the warmth of that move through him, and she was glad she had said it. Spring came back to the Arizona Territory with its particular extravagance. The desert wildflowers first, and then the deep greening of the grass in the lower pastures. and the whole ranch awakened from its winter quiet with a surge of energy and newness. The cattle began to calve in March, and Florence, who had been through one partial calving season the previous spring, found herself much more competent and confident this time, working beside Matthew and beside Caleb with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to trust her own hands. A new calf was born on a clear March morning who was white-faced and stubborn and immediately established herself as the personality of the calving pen, and Hector named her Coronla, which means colonel in Spanish, and the name stuck because it was clearly appropriate. Florence, watching Coronla investigate her world with imperious thoroughness, laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that surprises you with its own fullness. And Matthew, standing beside her at the fence, looked at her with a smile that had the quality of someone watching the sun come out. In the spring, Florence wrote a letter to Matthew's sisters in Missouri. She had heard enough about them, Emma and Clara, 22 and 20 years old respectively, to feel she knew them in outline, and she wrote to introduce herself and to say that she and Matthew would be glad to have them come and visit if they ever had the means and inclination to make the journey west. The letter she received in reply, written jointly in two different hands that were clearly sisters, was warm and funny and very slightly wild, and Matthew read it at the kitchen table and looked up at her with an expression of grateful surprise. "They like you," he said. "They like the idea of me," she said. "They will like me more when they meet me." He shook his head with fond certainty. "They will," he said. Clara and Emma Bailey arrived in Callow Creek in June of 1879 on the stage from Tucson, having made the considerable journey from Missouri by rail to the territorial border, and then by stage the rest of the way. Florence and Matthew met them at the stage stop, and the two young women emerged dusty and animated, and immediately began talking simultaneously in the particular manner of two people who have been talking simultaneously all their lives. Clara was 22, tall and brown-haired like Matthew, with quick dark eyes and opinions she made no effort to conceal. Emma was 20 and slight and laughed at everything, not the shallow laugh of someone performing delight, but the genuine laugh of someone for whom humor was a primary mode of engagement with the world. Florence liked them immediately, which she had expected. They liked her immediately, which they made thoroughly clear, and within 24 hours of arriving at the ranch, they had taken her completely as one of their own with the generous certainty of people who have always had enough room in their hearts to add to the number. It was a full and happy month, the Bailey sisters bringing into the ranch the particular energy of people experiencing new country for the first time with open eyes. They rode with Florence and Matthew, helped with the work in the cheerful if somewhat chaotic manner of enthusiastic beginners, sat up late at the kitchen table with tea and conversation that ranged from the highly serious to the entirely ridiculous. One evening Clara sat beside Florence on the porch steps and said, in the direct way she had, "You are the best thing that has ever happened to my brother. I want you to know that I have not always thought that about anyone in his life." Florence looked at her. "He is a man worth thinking well of someone for," she said. "He is," Clara said. "He spent too many years being good and quiet and useful and not asking for anything for himself. I used to worry about him." She paused. "I do not worry about him now." Florence looked out at the yard where Matthew was showing Emma how to assess the soundness of a horse's hooves with the patient thoroughness he brought to all teaching, and Emma was listening with her head tilted and her hands on her hips in a posture of concentrated attention that was somehow like him, and Florence felt a warmth that was full and without complication. "Neither do I," she said. The sisters stayed a month and then traveled back to Missouri with promises to return, and the ranch settled back into its particular combination of work and quiet that was Florence's life now, and that she had come to understand was exactly the life she would have built had she been given the choice from the beginning. In the fall of 1879, Florence told Matthew one evening after supper, with the matter-of-fact directness she brought to important things, that they were going to have a child. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him take the information in the way he took all significant things, carefully, without rushing to a response before the whole weight of it had settled. Then he stood up from the table and came to her and took her hands in his, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and full and slightly awed, and he said, "Florence." Just her name, just that. "Yes," she said. "Sometime in April, I think." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest where his heart was, and she could feel it beating with the slight elevation of feeling under the usual steadiness, and she thought that there were very few gestures she had ever been offered that had said more. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I feel entirely myself, just more so in some ways." He smiled at that, and it was the full, genuine smile that she had been the cause of on many occasions now, and still found to be one of the things she was most glad of in her days. They told Caleb and Hector the next morning, and Caleb shook Matthew's hand with the grave satisfaction of an older man, seeing things come right, and Hector expressed his feelings by removing his hat and spinning it in a full circle before replacing it, and saying that this was the best news, and that he had known from the start that things were going to go right here. Florence wrote to Clara and Emma, whose reply was so full of exclamation points and plans to return that the letter took her 3 readings to get all the information out of it. The winter of 1879 was mild, and Florence moved through it with the same purposefulness she brought to everything, adapting the work as she needed to, letting Matthew take on more of the physical heavy work without making a production of the adjustment, because they were both practical people who understood that circumstances required different things at different times. They talked about the child in the evenings, about names and about what they hoped for, which was simple and serious, and about character more than circumstance. They hoped for someone honest and curious and capable of kindness. They hoped for someone who would know they were loved from the beginning, which was the one thing they were most certain they could provide. In the late evenings before the fire, Matthew would sometimes read aloud while Florence sat beside him with her feet tucked up and her head against his shoulder, and the fire would speak in the language of fire, and the house was warm, and the land outside was quiet under the winter stars, and she would think about the borrowed horse and the 400 miles and the letter in her pocket, and the man she had come prepared to confront, and she would feel the full and settled weight of what had come from all of that, which was more, she thought, than any reasonable accounting of the circumstances should have produced. Thomas Bailey was born in April of 1880 in the Garrison quarter, in the room that faced east, at about 4 in the morning when the sky was beginning to go from black to the deep blue of approaching dawn. He arrived with considerable determination, which Florence felt was appropriate, and he was healthy and emphatic about the world from his first moments in it. Matthew held him with the particular careful attention he brought to everything he valued, and looked at this small, precise, complete person with an expression that Florence, watching from the bed with the specific and extraordinary exhaustion of new birth, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Thomas," Matthew said softly, as though confirming the name to the child himself. "Thomas Edmund Bailey," Florence said. The middle name was new, decided in this moment, and she watched Matthew look up at her quickly. "Edmund," he said. "He should have something of him," she said. "However complicated that is, he should have something." Matthew looked at her with the full weight of his feeling and then back at the child. "Thomas Edmund," he said quietly. "Yes." Clara and Emma arrived in May, as promised, and the household for the next 6 weeks was a wonderful kind of organized chaos, the sisters taking enormous pleasure in the baby, with the enthusiastic involvement of aunts who feel no responsibility for the less appealing aspects of infant care, and all the pleasure of the entertaining parts. Clara, who had been writing to a man in Albuquerque for some time, and had not mentioned it until she arrived, and Florence noticed the letters, admitted under gentle questioning that she was considerably interested in this man, whose name was Peter, and Florence and Matthew took identical pleasure in telling her she should not be shy about it, which she assured them she was not. Emma, 21 now and thinking about what came next in her life, spent one evening talking seriously with Florence about the possibility of finding work that was not domestic service, which was what she had been doing in Missouri and which she liked less and less. Florence talked to her about the changes that were slowly coming, about women who were establishing themselves in businesses, in trade, in the territories where the old rules were less fixed, and they sat together at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and talked with the seriousness and pleasure of two women who enjoy thinking hard about things. By the time the sisters left at the end of June, Emma had decided to look into the possibility of a teaching position in one of the new territorial schools, which were opening steadily as the territory settled, and which needed teachers badly and were, in some cases, willing to hire women of ability and education. Florence, watching the stage take them back toward Tucson and the railroad, felt the particular bittersweet quality of good company departing, and then felt Matthew's hand find hers, and she turned back toward the ranch and toward everything that was her life here. Thomas grew into toddlerhood with the determined curiosity of a child who has been loved well and shown the world with enthusiasm. He could identify the horses in the corral by their voices before he could name most of the people he knew, and Hector taught him to say Coronla, which was not the most useful first word, but was certainly the most entertaining. Florence ran the Garrison quarter, which was what people in Callow Creek called it and what she called it, because it had been her father's name and she had made her peace with his name now, not without complexity, but with the particular kind of peace that comes when you have fully reckoned with a thing and decided to carry the good of it and set down the weight of the bad. She ran it with increasing competence, and by the time Thomas was 2 years old, with genuine mastery. She had learned everything she had needed to learn, and several things she had not anticipated needing to learn, including negotiation with cattle buyers, which she found she had a distinct talent for, and the management of a small but real dispute with the county about water rights, which she navigated with reference to the appropriate territorial statutes, and won entirely. Matthew worked beside her through all of it with the same steady devotion that had characterized his 4 years of keeping the place for her before she arrived, except that now it was different. Now it was theirs, and they both knew it, and the knowledge had a warmth and a weight that made all the work feel particular. He was a good father, which she had expected. He was patient and full of genuine attention, and he talked to Thomas as though the child's questions were worth answering, which Thomas clearly found gratifying, and which resulted in a child of 2 who had very strong opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. In the summer of 1882, they found out that Thomas was going to be a brother. Emma, who had established herself as a teacher in the school at Callow Creek, and was, by all accounts, excellent at it, received the news with the same enthusiasm she had brought to everything and immediately drafted a list of suggested names that covered 2 pages of paper and ranged from the very sensible to the deeply ambitious. The second child arrived in January of 1883, a girl this time, with copper-red hair the color of her mother's, and the particularly settled gaze of a person who has decided to take stock of things before committing to an opinion. They named her Ruth, a plain and solid name that suited her, and she was a serious and watchful baby who considered the world with the same careful attention that her father brought to everything. Clara came out from Albuquerque with her husband Peter that spring, which was the first time Florence and Matthew had met him in person, and he turned out to be a quiet, honest man who was visibly devoted to Clara in a way that Clara found appropriate and everyone else found charming. They stayed 2 weeks, and the house was full and warm and loud in the best way, Thomas demonstrating to his baby sister and his aunt and uncle everything he considered noteworthy about the ranch, which was most of it. On the last evening before Clara and Peter left, Florence and Matthew sat on the porch after the children were in bed and after the guests had gone inside, and the night was the deep warm blue of a summer desert evening, and the stars were out in their full extravagance, and the ranch below them was quiet and complete. Florence leaned her head back against her chair and looked up at the sky. "Do you ever think," she said, "about the version of things where I came here and found exactly what I expected to find? A man who had helped himself to my inheritance and had no intention of making it right." Matthew considered this. "I think about what that would have meant for you," he said, "and I am glad it was not what you found." "I am glad too," she said, "though I was prepared for it." "I know you were," he said. "I could see it the moment you rode into the yard." A woman with a letter and a revolver and 400 miles of road behind her and not a single intention of being turned aside. She smiled. "I was quite angry." "You were magnificent," he said. "You have been magnificent every day since." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the steady, warm, direct attention that was so entirely and completely his. The look that she had come to understand was simply what love looked like when it was honest and without performance, and she felt the fullness of her life in a way that sometimes caught her off guard with its completeness. "Matthew Bailey," she said, "you kept my inheritance safe for 4 years and never said a word to me about it." "I did," he said. "You could have written to me. I could have." "Why did you not?" He was quiet for a moment, thoughtful. "Because it was not mine to give you. And I was not sure for a long time that a letter from a stranger would have brought you." And he paused. "If I am fully honest, I was waiting for something I could not entirely name. I was waiting for you to come yourself. I believed you would." She looked at him for a long time. "And when I came," she said, "you were right there." "I was right there," he said. "I am always going to be right there." She reached across the gap between their chairs and found his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, warm and steady as everything he was, and they sat together on the porch of the Garrison quarter in the deep summer night. And the land spread out before them in the starlight, good land, tended land, land that had waited for her and that she had come to. And the life they had built on it was solid and full and entirely, completely theirs. Ruth learned to walk in the spring with the same deliberate purposefulness with which she seemed to approach everything, and Thomas appointed himself her instructor in all things related to the ranch, a role he undertook with the magnificent authority of a 4-year-old, who believes his expertise to be comprehensive. He showed her the horses and the chickens, and the cattle and the vegetable garden that Florence had planted along the south wall of the house, where the light was good, and he told her the names of all of them, with the particular solemnity of important information being transmitted to someone who needed to know it. Caleb, who had been with the ranch longer than anyone, retired in the summer of 1883 with the considerable goodwill of everyone who knew him, and a sum of money that Florence insisted on providing, and that Matthew did not argue with because he had been thinking the same thing. Caleb went to live with his daughter's family in Tucson, and they gave him a send-off from the ranch that included a supper and a speech by Matthew that was honest and warm. And Caleb, who was not a sentimental man, looked at the ground throughout it and then looked up at the end with eyes that were brighter than usual and shook Matthew's hand and looked at Florence and said, "Your father would have been proud of you, Miss Florence. I mean Mrs. Bailey. I keep forgetting." "Either will do," Florence said. "I answer to both." A new hand came on, a young man named Samuel who was 20 years old and had come up from the border country and who worked hard and learned fast, and the operation of the ranch continued with its daily discipline and seasonal rhythm. Emma, who was 25 now and had been teaching in Callow Creek for 3 years, had become one of the more respected figures in the town, and she had recently begun corresponding with a widower named John Alcott, who had moved to town the previous year with his 8-year-old son and who taught at the same school. Florence observed this development with private pleasure and said nothing unless asked, because Emma was a person who made her own path and would not appreciate unsolicited guidance. She was asked, one afternoon in the late summer, When Emma came to the ranch on her day off and sat with Florence on the porch while Thomas and Ruth played in the yard and Matthew and Samuel were out checking the cattle. "Tell me," Emma said, "because you are the most direct person I know, what do you think of John Alcott?" Florence considered. "I think he is quiet and serious and clearly devoted to his son," she said. "I think he looks at you when you are not looking at him in a way that suggests his feelings are considerably more than professional." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I have noticed that." "And you?" Florence said. Emma looked at her with the bright, honest eyes she had always had. "I think," she said, "that I understand Matthew a little better than I did now. The thing of knowing someone slowly. The thing of finding out who a person is over time and then realizing you do not particularly want them to be elsewhere." Florence smiled. "That is a good way to know someone." Emma nodded. "I learned it from watching the two of you," she said. "Which I hope you do not find embarrassing." "I find it entirely satisfying," Florence said. The afternoon sun was warm, and the children's voices carried clearly in the good air, and the ranch smelled of dry grass and summer. And Florence sat with Emma, and felt the fullness of a life that had been built from a long ride and a hard-kept anger and an unexpected man, and all the things that had come after. And she thought that if she had been asked, on the day she left Tucson on a borrowed horse with a letter in her pocket and 400 miles ahead of her, whether this was where she would end up, she would not have been able to imagine it. She was glad she could not have imagined it, because the thing itself was better than anything she could have made up. Matthew came back from the pasture as the sun was getting low, and he came across the yard and up the porch steps with his hat pushed back and a slight sunburn on his nose and the look of a man who has been doing good work in good company and is glad to be home. And he saw Florence sitting with Emma and the children playing below, and he paused at the top of the steps for just a moment, looking at all of it with that steady, careful attention of his. Florence looked up at him. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. "The East herd is in fine shape. Sam is learning fast." He looked at his sister. "Emma, staying for supper?" "Obviously," Emma said. He smiled, and it was the full, genuine smile that Florence had once thought was a rare thing and now understood was simply what he looked like when he was happy, and he was happy frequently and completely in the direct, unperforming way that good happiness is. He sat on the step beside Florence's chair, and she reached down and rested her hand on his shoulder, and he covered it with his briefly. And below them, Thomas was showing Ruth something in the dirt with great seriousness, some finding or discovery that mattered intensely to him, and that Ruth was examining with her characteristic careful attention. And the evening light came golden and long across the Garrison quarter, and lit the red bluffs in the distance like something burning pleasantly. And everything was as it was, and as it should be. The life they had built sat solid and warm around them, the good accounts and the straight fences, the tended land and the repaired barn, the kitchen with its books on the shelf, including the land law volume that had waited for someone to read it, the porch where they had talked themselves into love in the long evenings, the room facing east where the children had been born. The life that had been promised by a man who left and kept by a man who stayed and claimed at last by the woman who had come to demand what was hers and found, in the demanding of it, something she had not known she was looking for. The stars came out above the territory one by one, and then all at once, as they always did, filling the enormous sky with their ancient and particular brightness, and the Garrison quarter settled into the evening quiet of a good place well lived in. And Florence Bailey sat on her porch in the last of the warm day's light with her hand resting on her husband's shoulder and her children playing below her and her life surrounding her in every direction, complete and fully hers.